I am very, very excited to be back with you again this morning, and excited as we continue to carry on this conversation. My phone was going off last night until like 10:30 when I finally turned it off from folks saying, "Hey, here's the conversations that were taking place in our group," and just excited to be able to continue with you this morning as we get to think more about external focus. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. So let's just remember where we were last night. We were talking about the fact that in order to have an external focus, I have to look first at me. I recognize that every person in this world, me included, most needs to know that I am both more wicked and more loved than I could ever dare to imagine. It is when I can start to see that, understanding both of those sides of the equation are equally true, and I am loved in Jesus Christ, that I have the ability to start looking beyond myself, seeing the people around me and saying, that's what they need to know too. So how do I help them to hear this truth in Jesus? Well, what we're going to do this morning in this first session together is we're going to look at Jesus. Guys, we're going to look at the person who most knew, not that he was wicked, but that he was loved. That Jesus knew his identity in the Father, that he was 100% the beloved Son of his Father. And from that place of identity, lived external focus. So we're just going to keep the story going from where we picked up at last night. We're going to jump a little bit. Yesterday, we looked at Jesus' encounter with Jairus, a little bit about Jairus' daughter and the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And we're going to skip over the next part of Matthew chapter 9. Jesus heals the blind, and he causes someone who's possessed by a demon and unable to speak to be made whole, to be healed. And where we're going to pick up is at verse 35 of Matthew chapter 9, as what we're going to see is how Jesus interacts, what his living out of his identity allows him to do. Because I want our external focus, my external focus, our church's external focus to look like his. So let me pull it up on the screen for us. Matthew chapter 9, verses 35, through 38. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and all the villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and they were helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. As we unpack this passage of scripture together, this description of how Jesus goes about his ministry, right before, if you know where we're headed in chapter 10, right before he sends the disciples out in theirs, I think we see three things about Jesus, three things that are incredibly important for how we as individuals and as churches model our ministry that takes us beyond our walls. First, we're going to see Jesus' mission, what it was that he was about. We're going to see his compassion and how that moved him. And then we're going to see his conviction that undergirded everything that he did. So let's start with the beginning. Jesus' mission. Let's zero in for a second here on verse 35 again. Because Matthew tells us that Jesus went through all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And I break that out for us so that you see that and, friends, because I think it's really important. All of the Gospels, over and over again, when they talk about what Jesus did, they always have this phrase. And as a matter of fact, we'll see a little later in our time together this morning, this idea is the same template for how he sent the disciples out into the world, preaching and teaching the good news of the kingdom, right? So declaring with his words that the king has come, that heaven has broken into earth, and that those who follow Jesus are called into a new citizenship. We get to do what Jesus told us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. We get to pray for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, for heaven to break in. So he goes teaching, preaching about what does it mean. So he's teaching and preaching about what does it look like for heaven to break into earth. You know, in heaven, there won't be any isms, right? There's no such thing as sexism in heaven. There's no racism. There's no classism. Nothing like that plays out there. So Jesus goes and he teaches about this is the kingdom that's broken in. This is what it looks like for people made in the image of God to carry that out one with another. But he didn't stop there, right? He doesn't just preach and teach. There's an and. Jesus preaches, he teaches about the kingdom, and he heals every disease and sickness. He talks about heaven breaking into this earth, and then he made it happen. He fought for wholeness in a broken world. Every time you look at Jesus's mission, his ministry, the model for the way that he showed the world what the kingdom looks like, friends, it's always by embracing that and. He never divorces those two concepts. And part of me wishes we could just spend a whole weekend just talking about this, especially because in our present world and context, it feels like we try to divorce these two ideas, right? That we have people who I lovingly refer to as glorified Girl Scouts. You know what I mean? These are the Christians who never, ever, ever tell people about Jesus. They don't talk about his kingdom. They don't talk about the gospel. They're never going to mention the word that you are more wicked than you dare to imagine. But they will do all kinds of really nice things. They're engaged in social justice. They're engaged in good works, but divorced of telling the gospel. And then we've got other churches who look at the idea of doing that kind of ministry and say, why do we need to do that? Just tell people about Jesus. I had a pastor growing up. We told him we wanted to go on a mission trip. And he said, the only kind of mission trip you should ever go on is one where you stand on the street corners and you just preach the gospel. And we said, we were thinking we would do a couple of other things in addition to that. And he could not see why. Why would you go and serve? Why would you go and engage people? Why would you heal diseases and sicknesses? Just tell them the gospel. That's all they need. But when you look at Jesus's mission, it was always embracing the and. And there's a reason, right? It's because Jesus was interested in restoring wholeness, in taking shattered shalom and putting us back together again. We touched last night just a little bit on the word shalom. That word often gets translated as peace. I think a better translation is wholeness. That shalom is taking what has been broken by sin and putting it back together again. Now, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, there was perfect shalom. There was peace. It was actually the only marriage that ever knew just peace. There was no brokenness, right? No brokenness relationally or emotionally or physically. And then sin enters into the picture. And when sin entered into the picture, things got shattered. But when Jesus comes, when the King entered back into this world, he came to restore what was broken, to take broken lives and make them whole. And whole people, all of us, we are more than just spirituality. We're more than just relationship with the Lord. That is more important than anything else. But there's always an and. Because I experience brokenness even in my restored relationship with God the Father. I have brokenness in my body, or brokenness financially, or relationally with other people, or emotionally within myself. And the gospel speaks to all of that. Kingdom speaks to all of that. And that means that we're called to do the same. I mean, that's what Jesus did when we looked at the story last night of he and the woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years. And he could have just looked at her and said, "Woman, your sins are forgiven. You are restored to the Father. I'll see you in heaven." But he allowed her physical brokenness to be restored. So the relational brokenness could be restored. So the emotional brokenness could be restored. All of those pieces are what make us whole. And as we're thinking about, we're praying about, what does it look like to be a person who models our ministry after Jesus, then we have to always embrace the and. So I want you to think a little bit more about this for just a second. You've got chat boxes there. Tell me for a minute, all of us are familiar, I think, about how Jesus preached and how he taught about the kingdom. But how did he proclaim the gospel through what we would call social justice? Through deed and not just through word. There we go. No respecter of persons. He fed the 5,000, spoke to those who were unclean and would have been considered beneath him. The way that he engaged the woman caught in adultery, that he saw everyone, saw the socially rejected, the healings that he did. And these are great examples, that he lifted women up. And Devin says, paid attention to women. That he says, what you did to the least of these, you did for me. I like Lori Jennings. He gave the religious leaders the what for. He sure did. Ate with sinners. All of these ways. Jesus spoke the gospel, but then he lived it. Devin says he prioritized children. I mean, we've got tons of examples, right? The feeding of the 5,000, the healing. When he overchanged the money tables, he threw them out and he chased people out of the temple. That was Jesus coming and saying, all people are to have access to my Father. And so you cannot clutter up the court of the Gentiles and not permit this group of people to come and worship. Everything that Jesus did was this beautiful and. I found a really cool quote by Jaquel Ferris, and I'm going to read it to you. She said, Jesus provided physically for the poor while telling them about the spiritual riches they could have in him. He drew water for the thirsty, and he told them about the living water that could eternally satisfy. He served food to the hungry, and he preached about the bread of life. He cared about children and orphans, and he offered the opportunity to be God's children. And Jesus didn't ignore people's physical suffering, but he did prioritize their eternal suffering. It wasn't an either or. There wasn't a false dichotomy. It was a both and. As John Piper has said, Christians should care about all suffering, especially eternal suffering. And that's what Jesus did. He cared about suffering, and his radical love for people led to action. And I just loved the way she put that, especially in that opening paragraph, right? That the and. That he said, there's spiritual riches that's found only in me, and provided for the poor. Right? He said, I am living water, and actually provided for the needs that were right there in front of him. That's what gospel ministry looks like. And if our external focus is going to look like Jesus's, then as an individual and as a church, there always needs to be the and. Part of the reason for that, friends, is because that's what changes the world. I'm working my way right now through a book, and I'll be honest, I'm slogging my way through it because this bad boy, it is thicker than your Bible. But the book's called Dominion by a historian named Tom Holland. What I love about it is that Mr. Holland is not a believer, any way, shape, or form. He does not believe that Jesus is the King of Kings. He does not believe that when Jesus came, the kingdom of heaven entered into this earth. And so it is fascinating as he walks through history. And the subtitle of his book is How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. You get this man who doesn't for a moment believe the gospel, but he can look at the evidence of Christianity. And he starts with Jesus. And he talks about how Jesus embraced the and that what he taught led to an absolute, utter disruption of this world, because we would say heaven broke in. But then he's walked through the last 2,000 years of history, And he just points over and over and over again to how Christians who proclaimed and believed the gospel revolutionized the world because we then lived it. It's historically, it's Christians who started orphanages. It's Christians who started hospitals and hospices. It's Christians who stood up and said, we have to abolish slavery. It's Christians who have engaged in those very real needs, who've said, you need Jesus and you need to be made whole in all of these other ways. Last night, Corinne Smith was talking to us about what she and her husband are doing in Brazil. Guys, they're embracing the and. And the power of that is we bring heaven to earth. But even more so, we invite the rest of the world, the Tom Hollands of the world, to look and say there's got to be more to this story as these people are embracing the and. Now, if we had time, we would go through what we're watching churches in ABCOPAD do as we're embracing the and, because it is happening. It's already happening. We've got churches that are saying we want to proclaim the gospel in word and deed because we believe that the Lord wants to bring shalom to whole people and whole lives. If we had a little bit more time, Jody told you last night as she was introducing me about a prom dress giveaway that we did at First Norristown. And when I tell men that, they always roll their eyes like, that's the stupidest thing ever. But when you tell women and they go, there's something cool about that. Or something cool about opening up our church and inviting people anywhere within driving distance to come and say, you can have a dress, but we want you to get this dress because we want you to see that there is a God who sees and values you. It was a simple way of helping after the 2009 financial crisis in a community that got really hard hit. Other churches are doing things like Laundry Love, where we're taking money and going down to the local laundromat and just saying, we're here, we'll pay for your laundry. I know a couple churches are doing that, and they've got a reputation in the community where people know we show up that day, our needs are going to be met. Because here people are going to tell us the gospel, even as they care about the fact that our kids can't go to school with clean clothing because we just can't afford it right now. We don't have time to go into it in any kind of detail right now, but maybe here's our Kairos moment. I wonder, as you're looking at your church, does your church embrace the and? Every one of us kind of falls out on one side or the other. Churches that are more into proclaiming the gospel and we just assume people will come and hear and everything will get fixed. Or churches that say we're just going to do good things and we hope in the doing of the good thing you'll figure out Jesus exists. Does your church embrace the and? And remember the Kairos circle. Way too many of us have sat in meetings where we've observed, we've reflected, we've discussed what we're going to do, and nothing has changed. Take that conversation, put it into a plan, and start acting. And let's just see what the Lord does throughout our region. But we got to keep trucking this morning. Jesus' mission was embracing the and. And part of why he did that was because he was fueled by compassion. So let's look at the next verse. Matthew 9:36, the first part says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. That's a really beautiful word, friends. It is one that's worth us taking a couple minutes to unpack. Because if you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll find that the word that got translated here as compassion is only used either on the lips of Jesus or about Jesus. This idea of compassion defines him. It reveals his heart. So I think it's worth us taking a look at it for just a minute. So here's your Greek lesson for the day. Ready? The fancy word that gets translated as compassion is that. Splunknen, if you want to try and pronounce that. The noun for compassion in the Greek language literally refers to your intestines, your entrails, your gut. The verb that comes from the word that's on your screen right now means that your intestines, your entrails twist and turn in response to the hurt that you see around you. Right? That's the Greek definition of compassion. That everything in my gut wells up and I am moved to respond to the pain I see. That's the word that is used to describe Jesus over and over again. So for instance, Matthew 14, when Jesus sees another crowd, he has compassion on them. His gut moves within him, it twists and turns, and it causes him to heal the sick. Chapter 15, when Jesus sees that the people are hungry, he has compassion, and it moves him to feed them. Chapter 20, when Jesus sees the two blind men's faith and their distress, he has compassion on them, touches their eyes, and restores their sight. Luke chapter 7, when Jesus sees the weeping widow, he feels compassion and he raises her son from the dead. That's just a smattering of examples in the Gospels. But what you watch is every time Jesus feels compassion, he doesn't just look and say, I shed a couple tears, I feel a little pity. He moves. And when Jesus tells stories, he tells stories about people who experience compassion and then move. So Matthew 18, the parable of the unmerciful servant, when the unmerciful servant begs for pity, he begs for forgiveness from the master. In the parable, Jesus says the master feels compassion and he exercises forgiveness. He cancels the debt. Luke chapter 10, when the Samaritan passes by the man who's been waylaid on the road, Jesus says the Samaritan feels compassion and he rescues the man, pays for everything that will be necessary for the man to be healed. In the prodigal son parable, when the son comes back, the father looks at him with compassion, and the compassion causes the father to run and embrace him. You getting the point? When we're talking about the compassion that Jesus Christ has, it is a compassion that moves. It is a compassion that causes us to go toward the place where shalom is broken and work to see it be restored. Now, I love that word. I like preaching that word. I love that that is how Jesus moves towards me, right? That when Jesus looks at me in my hurt, when Jesus looks at me in the places where I feel like he should run the other direction, his heart attitude, or in this case, his gut attitude, is to feel compassion, move toward me, and bring about shalom. That's amazing. But it's not always how I feel. You know, I have a friend, her name is Sue. Sue is, she actually just retired. She's been a nurse her whole life. And Sue, like, oozes compassion. She sees any need, anybody. There has never been a person in Sue's world who is an inconvenience. Every problem, everything within her wells up, and she just moves towards that person. And I love Sue for that. But I am not Sue. As a matter of fact, that's pretty rare in my world. So I want you to try something for me for a second. Find those chat boxes again. And I want you to put yourself in the position of the disciples, right? Sanctified imagination for a moment. Imagine, and we'll do this all at once. Imagine that you're the disciples and the unclean bleeding woman shows up when Jesus is on his way to rescue the little girl. Or Jairus comes, and he's a leader in the synagogue and well respected, but he has a need. When the two blind men come and they beg Jesus to heal them, or the demon-possessed mute man shows up, or the crowd of hungry people who should have packed their own lunch, what do you think they felt? You know, what would you guess was their underlying emotion when all of these needy people put in an appearance? Lori says, he can't do what we're scheduled to do. This is ruining our day, and we got to deal with this. A waste of time. Yvonne says he'd feel irritated. Brittany says he's probably, or they would be annoyed. But some others, confused, inconvenienced. Devin says tapped out. Yeah, by the time that crowd showed up, I'd have been really tapped out. Tired. Distracted, like this is taking us away from the things that actually matter. Proud. Sally says maybe they feel disgusted. Jody would say my heart would be broken. Overwhelmed. These are some great ideas. Incredulous, Cora says. I don't really know what they felt. My guess is that of the 12, at least a couple of them were like my friend Sue, who said, we have to meet these needs. And probably the rest of them, based off of what we read in the Gospels about those disciples in moments like this, were irritated. Compassion was not their go-to emotion. And if I'm honest with you, it's not always what I feel either when there's a homeless person on the street. Sometimes it is when my well-to-do, really nice neighbor shows up. And I don't know about you guys, but my compassion level goes up or down depending on whether I think the person deserves it or what I think brought them into the situation they're in. And here's the thing. All of us are going to struggle at different times to feel compassion. And all of us at some point are going to feel overwhelmed by the need that's around us. We're going to talk in the next session about the fact that I can't meet every need. It's not my job. But what I can do, if I want to continue to develop compassion like Jesus, is look closer. At first, it can look closer at him. You know, if you sat for a little bit in the parable of the prodigal sons, and you just picture the compassion on the Father's face, you'll start to get an idea of how Jesus looks at you and at the person that's in front of you. And then I would encourage you to look closer at the people who are in front of you, to consider more closely who they are and recognize that they can be the most put together, well-dressed person, and there's still shattered shalom in their life. And that the person who is the neediest one you've ever met is there, and in this moment needs the kingdom of heaven to come. So here's your Kairos question, just to get you thinking and to take with you later on today. As you look around you and you compare yourself to Jesus, does his compassion move you? I find the more I look at Jesus and his compassion, the more I'm ready to be moved. Here's the last thing we're going to talk about today, as we're looking at the way that Jesus engages in external focus, right? His mission is always to embrace the and, because he's fueled by compassion. And underneath that compassion is an incredibly real conviction. It's one that he never wavers from, friends. Because if you finish verse 36, it says that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Now, that's a powerful sentence. And when Jesus looked at the crowd of people there, some of whom were probably the most well-to-do, life put together, everything was going pretty well, Jesus looked at those people and said, they are harassed and they are helpless. And Jesus looked at the other folks in the crowd who maybe really genuinely were desperate in that moment. And he said the same thing about them. And that sentence, friends, for Matthew and his contemporaries really would have mattered, right? His contemporaries knew sheep don't do well without a shepherd. You have never, not one time in your whole life, heard about a flock of wild sheep. Not a thing. Because sheep without a shepherd die. The sheep need a shepherd to lead them, to protect them, to bring them to food and water, to examine them. Sheep require shepherds. It's how we are kept safe. So when Jesus looked at any person in front of him, whether it was the religious leader, whether it was his disciples, whether it was the person coming and begging for his help, he was moved by compassion, because when he saw them, he knew their most basic need was for a good shepherd. Now, here's what I'm going to do. For the next minute and a half, I want you to look at pictures of faces. And as you're looking at the pictures of faces, I want you to just think within yourself As each face comes up, is your gut reaction. That's a person who, if they don't know Jesus Christ, they are harassed and they are helpless. That's their fundamental definition of who they are. What did you see? Did you see people who are harassed and helpless without a shepherd? What about in this last one? Nameless faces. What if you were to put there the faces of your friends and family? The people that you know, the people you love, good, moral people. When you look at their faces, do you share the same conviction that Jesus shared? That if they are without the good shepherd, those are people who are destined to die. Truth is, friends, Jesus is a really good shepherd. And everyone needs that shepherd. And we talk about it in our churches, but that underlying conviction, if I'm honest, doesn't always translate into how I see the people around me. It's when that conviction takes firm root in me, it changes how I see people. It causes me to want to embrace the mission of the and. It makes me feel compassion that pushes me to say, how am I called to move towards this person in their life? Because I'm absolutely convinced that every person needs their brokenness put back together, and it will only be done in Jesus Christ.